Moving on. So now that we know simple selection and basic sequences, we're going to go into multi-selection. Multi-selection is basically more of the same in terms of logic, but the actual words that we use are going to be different. Click, please. There we go. So to do this, we're going to use what we call a case statement. Now, immediately, most people are going to say, oh, I need to use a switch statement. Again, you don't need to. You can if you're testing equality and you follow all the rules needed for a switch statement. But more often than not, you're probably going to be using an if-elsif statement. So just like there were keywords for our if-then-else statement, there are keywords for our case statement. In this case, there are 4 again, and they're probably exactly what you think they are with a few additions. Obviously, we have case. We're going to use this keyword of, others, and end case, of course. Now, the of one is a little awkward, but we'll see. You'll see how that works. So conditions are used to indicate various alternatives. What this means is more than 2 choices. Now, what you need to realize is that it doesn't have to be just equality. We can be testing less than, greater than. We can use compound statements, whatever we'd like. I'm going to show you a few examples of both these. Okay, let's take a look at this. So here's your general form. Case, some expression of. Condition 1, sequence 1. Condition 2, sequence 2. And so on and so forth. You can have as many conditions as you like. You could even have what we call this other statement. And that works just like an else case. In fact, that's exactly what it is. It's your default sequence. It means if it doesn't go into any of the previous conditions, execute this code. Well, just like else is optional in an if statement, well, others is also optional. You don't have to have it. It's completely up to you. So the others clause is optional. Conditions are normally numbers. So what that means is, like, you might be saying, let's say case age of, you might have 13, which means, hey, you're a teenager now. You might have 18, hey, you can vote now. You might have 19, hey, you can gamble now. You might have 65, hey, you get to retire now. Things like that. That type of thing. So they can be English statements or some other notation that specifies the condition under which the given sequence is to be performed. So it could be something just written verbally, as long as it's clear, short, and concise. I'm going to give you some examples that clarifies this a little bit. First example, case title of. So what I'm doing here is I'm comparing, oh, that T should be a little T, should be a little title. Case title of Mr., Mrs., Ms., Ms., Doctor. So based on what the value of title is, if title is Mr., then I'm going to say display Mr. Mrs., display Mrs. So I'm displaying the phonetic version of the actual short form here. Now, a couple things here. First of all, you'll notice that I have my surrounding set, case, end case. Everything else is indented inside. This is normal. We have our test value. So is title equal to Mr.? If it is, display, quote, Mr. Great. Now, what if you want more than one line of logic? You can't just put lines and lines and lines and lines of logic at the one after another there. What you need to do is basically you're going to put your logic for your case. So let's say you're Mr. It's going to go underneath the value you're testing against, and you just list them off in sequence like you normally would. Almost like a switch statement, where we may have one line of code, or we might have 10 lines of code. And you just put a sequence of logic in there. Now, because there's only one line of code here, I just put it on the same line, and that's perfectly valid. Everybody understands, safe space, it's easy to read. The next one, it also only has one line, the next example, but I purposely put it on the next line to show that you can do that. So let's take a look at that. This one's a little bit more complex. So in this case, I'm testing the value of grade. So case grade of. If grade is greater than or equal to 80, I'm going to set level to 4. So we're talking school levels, 1, 2, 3, 4. R means you're not passing, and I means insufficient. So going through this, if your grade is greater than or equal to 80, you're a level 4 student. If your grade is greater than or equal to 70 and less than or equal to 79, you're a level 3 student. 60 to 69 is level 2, 50 to 59 is level 1, less than 50 means you're failing, and others means I. Well, what does that actually mean? It means you might not have a grade at all. Oftentimes I'll have a student who joins the class late, and the report cards are coming, and I don't have any marks for that student yet, so I would put an I for insufficient. right? It happens. Now, you can see the differences here. I'm checking non-equality. I'm checking greater than or equal to. I'm doing compound statements. And I'm also putting the logic on the next line. Also indented so we can see that it's clearly dependent on that greater than or equal to 80, for example. If I had more logic, I would just put it right underneath that set level equal 4 and just so on and so forth until I need to. And the indentation makes everything clear and easy to read. So that's our case statements. Great. Now, we just talked about the two different selection statements. And when we first learned selection, one of the things we talked about were nested if statements, or nesting. And nesting just basically means that when we have one structure inside of another structure, one control structure inside of another control structure. So it might be an if statement inside of a switch inside of an if, a loop inside of an if inside of a loop, so on and so forth. Anything you really want there. How do we do that? Indentation. Again, indentation, indentation, indentation. So this is made clear, as I said, by indenting. So let's look at a quick example. Now, you've seen this example. We did this exact same example when we first talked about nested if statements. So first thing I'm going to say, well, enter a rectangle length. I'm going to read that rectangle length. I'm going to say, give me a width. I'm going to read that width. Now, you notice how everything is spelled out. Ask, read, ask, read, ask, read, all that kind of stuff. So it has to be clear. Don't make assumptions. Now, if the programmer sees this design, they're going to say, okay, if I'm making a console program, I have to follow it exactly like this. If I'm making a form program, I'm going to put all that prompting right on the form and read it all at once. Again, it depends on what language they're working in. If length is greater than 0, well, then I'm going to do something. What am I going to do? I'm going to test to see if the width is greater than 0. So if it gets inside of that width, it only got there because the length was greater than 0 as well. So if both of them are true, I can actually calculate the area. So I'm going to compute area equals length times width. And I'm going to display that area. Now this logic, these two lines of code inside, only occur if both of those if statements evaluated to true. Now I'm going to ask you, briefly, how did we fix this problem to make it a little bit more simple and clear? Compound. So we could just as easily write something like, let me see, I could write if length is greater than 0 and width is greater than 0, then I could do that same logic inside. I would indent, compute, area equals length times width, and display area, plus area. Now we don't have any units or anything like that, but normally it'd be great to actually display those units. And I only need a single end if here, because there's only one if statement. Whereas if we look at the actual logic over here, we have an end if for each one. This end if applies to this if because they're in line. This end if applies to this if because they're in line. That's why the indentation is super important. Okay, I'm going to pause that video there because the next one's going to completely shift gears and we'll move on from there.